The wind howled across Northridge Mountain as 6 friends loaded their gear into 2 pickup trucks on that crisp October morning in 2012. What started as an innocent weekend climbing trip would become one of the most disturbing missing persons cases in Colorado history. Blake Morrison, 28, stood at the center of the group, his voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. Even then, something felt wrong about him. The way he barked orders at the others, the way his eyes never quite met yours when he spoke, the way he smiled just a little too wide when things went his way. If you've ever met someone who made your skin crawl the moment they opened their mouth, hit that subscribe button because you're about to hear about the worst kind of person imaginable. The group consisted of Blake, the self-appointed leader who worked as a corporate consultant, Jaxon Chen, a quiet software engineer, River Williams, an outdoor gear shop owner, Sage Brooks, a college student studying geology, Knox Patterson, a paramedic with years of mountain rescue experience, and Iris Vale, a photographer documenting their adventure. They'd been planning this trip for months, drawn by Northridge's reputation as an untouched wilderness. The mountain stood nearly 14,000 feet tall, with weather patterns so unpredictable that even experienced climbers avoided certain routes. Blake had insisted on leading the expedition despite Knox having far more climbing experience. From the very beginning, Blake made it clear he was in charge. He'd researched the mountain obsessively, claiming he'd found secret routes that would give them access to areas no other climbers had ever documented. When Knox questioned the safety of Blake's proposed path, Blake publicly embarrassed him in front of the group, calling him a coward who wasn't committed to pushing boundaries. That should have been everyone's first red flag, but Blake had a way of making people doubt themselves. The first 3 days went smoothly enough, though Blake's behavior grew increasingly strange. He insisted on controlling all communication with the outside world, keeping everyone's cell phones in his pack, claiming it would help them disconnect from modern life. He photographed and filmed everything obsessively, often catching people at unflattering moments and laughing about it. When Iris asked to review some of the footage for her own documentation, Blake refused, saying he needed to maintain creative control over their story. On day 4, as they set up camp near a rocky outcrop, Blake announced they'd be taking what he called a shortcut through an unmapped ravine. Knox immediately objected, pointing out that unmarked terrain posed serious risks, especially with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Blake's response was swift and cruel. He accused Knox of trying to sabotage the trip out of jealousy, suggesting that Knox couldn't handle not being the leader for once. The verbal attack was so vicious that Iris later wrote in her journal that she'd never seen anyone tear another person down so systematically. What made Blake's behavior even more disturbing was how he seemed to enjoy the discomfort he caused. When River mentioned feeling uneasy about the route change, Blake spent the next hour making subtle digs about River's courage, questioning whether he belonged on a serious expedition. When Sage tried to mediate, Blake turned on him too, suggesting that maybe some people just weren't cut out for real adventure. The psychological pressure was relentless. By the evening of day 4, the group dynamics had shifted completely. Blake had successfully isolated anyone who questioned him, while those who stayed quiet found themselves walking on eggshells, afraid of becoming his next target. Knox, despite his experience and legitimate safety concerns, had been reduced to silence. Iris documented this transformation in her journal, writing that Blake seemed to feed off the tension he created. The last communication with the outside world came on the morning of day 5. Blake sent a brief text to his girlfriend saying everything was going perfectly and they'd found some amazing undiscovered areas. What he didn't mention was that they were already lost. Knox had been trying to navigate using his GPS and compass, but Blake kept overruling his directions, insisting his mysterious map showed a better way. When Knox finally confronted him privately about the map, Blake became defensive and aggressive, accusing Knox of undermining his authority. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered overhead, the group realized they were completely off course. Blake's shortcut had led them into a maze of rocky ravines and dense forest with no clear exit. Worse, their supplies were running lower than expected because Blake had miscalculated their needs. When River suggested they activate their emergency beacon, Blake flew into a rage, screaming that they weren't quitters and that he'd get them out safely if everyone just trusted him. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Iris made one final journal entry that would later chill investigators to the bone. She wrote that Blake had started talking to himself when he thought no one was listening, muttering about tests and loyalty and proving something important. She described feeling genuinely afraid of him for the first time, noting that his eyes had taken on what she called a predator quality. She ended the entry with words that would haunt the families forever. "I don't think Blake ever planned for us to come home the same people we were when we left. I'm starting to wonder if he planned for us to come home at all." That night, as the storm intensified, the group took shelter under a rocky overhang. Blake sat apart from the others, still clutching his mysterious map and filming everything with his camera despite the others' protests. In the darkness, as lightning illuminated the mountain peaks around them, 6 people went to sleep. By morning, their nightmare would truly begin, and Blake's true nature would be revealed in ways that would shock even the most experienced investigators. When dawn broke on day 5, Sage was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty, still warm, with his boots missing but everything else left behind. Blake's reaction told everyone exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. Instead of showing concern or organizing a search, he shrugged and said Sage probably got scared and headed back down the mountain alone. When Knox pointed out that no experienced hiker would leave without their gear, especially in a storm, Blake's mask slipped completely. He screamed that Knox needed to stop questioning every decision and accused him of trying to create panic. What happened next revealed Blake's true character. As the others searched the immediate area calling Sage's name, Blake calmly packed up camp, insisting they needed to keep moving. When Iris asked how they could abandon Sage, Blake's response was chilling. He said that weak people who couldn't handle real challenges had no business on serious expeditions, and if Sage wanted to quit like a coward, that was his choice. The way he spoke about a missing friend, someone who might be injured or lost, showed exactly what kind of monster he really was. If you're disgusted by people who abandon others in crisis situations, hit that like button because Blake's behavior only gets worse from here. River tried to reason with Blake, suggesting they stay put for a few hours in case Sage returned, but Blake refused to listen. He pulled out his camera and began filming what he called a documentary update, speaking directly into the lens about how some people just weren't mentally prepared for true adventure. He talked about Sage like he was a failed experiment rather than a missing human being. Knox later told investigators that watching Blake film that message while a friend was potentially dying somewhere on the mountain was one of the most disturbing things he'd ever witnessed. As they reluctantly followed Blake deeper into the wilderness, the group began to fracture. River and Knox whispered together about Blake's behavior, while Jaxon remained silent but clearly troubled. Iris kept her camera ready, secretly documenting Blake's increasingly erratic behavior. She captured footage of him talking to himself, practicing what seemed like speeches about survival and testing human limits. In one particularly disturbing clip, Blake could be heard saying that some people deserve to be left behind if they couldn't prove their worth. The terrain grew more treacherous as Blake led them through unmarked paths that seemed to go nowhere. When Knox pulled out his compass and pointed out they were heading in circles, Blake exploded. He accused Knox of sabotage, claiming that Knox was deliberately trying to get them lost out of jealousy. The verbal assault was so intense that Jaxon later described it as psychological torture. Blake seemed to know exactly which words would cut deepest, attacking Knox's competence, his courage, and even his relationships back home. By midday, they reached a clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching impossibly high into the sky. The tree looked ancient, twisted by decades of mountain weather into something that seemed almost alive. Blake became fixated on it immediately, calling it the perfect base camp and insisting they hang their gear from its branches to keep everything dry. There was something unsettling about the way he stared at that tree, like he'd been looking for it specifically. That night, under the oak's massive canopy, Blake's behavior became even more disturbing. River woke up around midnight to find Blake sitting at the base of the tree, whispering to himself while staring up into the branches. When River approached, Blake spun around with wild eyes and accused him of spying. The conversation that followed, partially captured on Iris's hidden audio recorder, revealed Blake's true mental state. He talked about tests and experiments, about proving that most people were weak and deserving of whatever happened to them. River tried to reason with Blake, asking what had happened to Sage and why Blake seemed so unconcerned. Blake's response chilled everyone who later heard the recording. He said that Sage had failed the test, that weak people always revealed themselves under pressure, and that maybe it was better for everyone if the weak ones were eliminated early. When River asked what he meant by eliminated, Blake just smiled and said that nature had its own ways of dealing with problems. The next morning brought another shock. River's sleeping bag was empty, his gear still hanging from the oak tree's branches, but no sign of him anywhere. Blake's reaction was identical to his response about Sage, a casual dismissal that made everyone's blood run cold. He suggested that River had probably panicked after their midnight conversation and tried to find his way back alone. When Knox demanded they search the area thoroughly, Blake refused, saying they'd already wasted too much time on people who couldn't handle real adventure. Iris, Knox, and Jaxon found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario. They were lost on an unmapped mountain with someone who clearly had no regard for human life. Worse, Blake controlled their emergency supplies and still had their phones. When Knox tried to activate his personal emergency beacon, he discovered Blake had secretly removed the batteries during the night. The realization that Blake was deliberately preventing them from calling for help changed everything. That evening, as they sat around a small fire under the oak tree, Blake announced that he had a confession to make. What he revealed would explain everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. He told them that this had never been a simple climbing trip. From the very beginning, he'd planned something much more sinister, something that would test the absolute limits of human survival and morality. As Blake spoke, his voice took on an excited, almost manic quality that made it clear they weren't dealing with someone who had simply lost his way. They were trapped with a predator who had been planning this nightmare for months. Blake's confession shattered what little sanity remained in their nightmare situation. As the fire crackled under the twisted oak branches, he explained that their climbing trip had been a lie from the very beginning. He'd been planning what he called a pure survival experiment for over 2 years, carefully selecting each member of the group based on psychological profiles he'd secretly compiled. He'd studied their social media, their relationships, their fears and weaknesses, building detailed files on each person like they were lab rats in his twisted study. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Blake had never intended for this to be a normal climbing trip. He'd deliberately led them into the most remote, unmappable part of Northridge Mountain where rescue would be nearly impossible. He'd miscalculated their supplies on purpose, removed safety equipment, and disabled their communication devices. Every decision that had seemed like poor judgment or ego was actually calculated manipulation designed to create the exact desperate situation they now found themselves in. What made Blake's confession even more sickening was how proud he seemed of his planning. He pulled out a leather journal filled with detailed notes about each group member's psychological breaking points. He'd written predictions about who would crack first, who would try to be the hero, and who would ultimately survive his test. Reading from his notes like a teacher giving a lecture, he explained that Sage and River had been categorized as weak variables from the beginning, people he expected to eliminate early in the process. Knox lunged at Blake in rage, but Blake was ready for the attack. He'd been carrying a knife the entire time, hidden in his jacket, and he used it to force Knox back. As he held the blade steady, Blake continued his sick explanation. He said he was conducting research on human survival instincts and moral boundaries, claiming he wanted to prove that civilization was just a thin mask that disappeared the moment people faced real pressure. He talked about their situation like it was a laboratory experiment rather than a life-or-death crisis involving real human beings. Iris kept her camera rolling, capturing every word of Blake's confession. In the footage that would later horrify investigators, Blake explained that he'd been documenting everything for what he called his survival psychology thesis. He planned to write about how quickly people abandoned their moral principles when faced with death, how readily they would sacrifice others to save themselves. The casual way he discussed using his friends as test subjects revealed a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. If you believe that people who manipulate and endanger others for their own sick purposes are the lowest form of human garbage, comment, Blake is a monster, because his evil only gets deeper. The most chilling part of Blake's confession was his timeline. He revealed that he'd been planning to gradually eliminate group members over the course of 2 weeks, studying how the survivors reacted to each loss. He wanted to document the exact moment when civilized people became animals willing to do anything to survive. He'd already decided that Knox would be next, followed by Jaxon, leaving Iris for last because he wanted to see how a lone woman would handle complete isolation with a predator. As Blake spoke, Jaxon slowly backed away from the fire, his face pale with terror. Blake noticed the movement and smiled, telling Jaxon that running wouldn't help because he knew every inch of the area they were trapped in. He'd spent months studying satellite images and topographical maps, identifying the perfect location for his experiment. The oak tree wasn't a random shelter, it was specifically chosen as his base of operations, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry but distinctive enough that he could always find his way back. Blake then revealed something that made their blood freeze. Sage and River weren't missing, they were dead. He'd killed Sage on the first night, making it look like the young man had wandered off in confusion. River had died the previous night after their confrontation, pushed off a cliff edge while trying to escape Blake's psychological torture. Blake described the murders with clinical detachment, explaining how he'd positioned the bodies where they'd never be found and documenting the entire process for his research. Knox made another desperate attempt to overpower Blake, but the corporate consultant had clearly planned for this moment too. He'd been working out obsessively for months, building the physical strength needed to overpower his victims. As they struggled near the fire, Blake managed to slash Knox across the arm with his knife, sending the paramedic stumbling backward. Blood poured from the wound as Knox collapsed against the oak tree, too weak to continue fighting. Blake stood over Knox's bleeding form and calmly explained that the paramedic had always been his primary target. Knox represented everything Blake hated about what he called false heroes, people who thought they could save everyone through skill and compassion. He wanted to prove that even the most altruistic person would become selfish and cruel when pushed to their absolute limits. Knox's death would be slow and documented, designed to break down Iris and Jaxon's remaining hope. As Knox weakened from blood loss, Blake turned his attention to the remaining survivors. He told Iris and Jaxon that they now faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives, however long those lives might last. They could try to save Knox and likely die in the process, or they could abandon him and focus on their own survival. Blake set up his camera to record their decision, explaining that this moment would be the centerpiece of his research on human moral flexibility. The clearing fell silent except for Knox's labored breathing and the wind rustling through the oak's ancient branches. Blake stood with his bloody knife, waiting to see if his remaining test subjects would prove his theory about human nature or surprise him with genuine courage. Iris made a decision that would save her life and end Blake's reign of terror. Instead of paralyzed fear or moral debate, she felt something else entirely, pure rage at watching a monster torture innocent people for his own twisted entertainment. While Blake focused on setting up his camera to record their supposed moral breakdown, Iris quietly reached for a heavy rock near the fire pit. She'd been documenting his confession the entire time, and now she had evidence of his murders and proof of his sick experiment. Knox was bleeding heavily but still conscious, his eyes meeting Iris's with desperate understanding. Jaxon crouched nearby, shaking with terror but ready to help if given the chance. Blake continued his psychological torture, explaining in detail how he planned to document each of their deaths for his research. He described the specific ways he intended to kill them, how he would study their final moments, and what conclusions he hoped to draw about human survival instincts. What Blake didn't expect was that his victims had been listening and learning too. Iris had been studying his behavior patterns, noting when he became distracted by his filming obsession and when he let his guard down. She'd realized that Blake's greatest weakness was his narcissistic need to document everything, his compulsion to capture his victims' suffering on camera rather than simply killing them efficiently. As Blake adjusted his camera angle to better capture Knox's suffering, Iris struck. The rock connected with the back of Blake's skull with a sickening crack, sending him stumbling forward toward the massive oak tree. He spun around, blood streaming from his head, the knife still clutched in his hand but his movements now unsteady and confused. The blow had disoriented him, but not enough to stop his murderous rampage. Blake charged at Iris with a roar of rage, the knife raised above his head. She dodged sideways, using his momentum against him, and he crashed into the oak's gnarled trunk. The impact should have stunned him, but Blake's fury seemed to give him inhuman strength. He turned back toward her, his face twisted with hatred, screaming that she'd ruined everything and destroyed months of careful planning. The fight that followed was captured on Blake's own camera, still recording from where he'd positioned it near the fire. The footage shows Iris fighting for her life against a man who'd planned her murder for months, using every ounce of strength and cunning to survive. Blake was bigger and stronger, but Iris was fighting with the desperation of someone who knew that failure meant not just her own death, but the deaths of Knox and Jaxon as well. Blake managed to corner Iris against the oak tree, the knife inches from her throat, when Jaxon made his move. Despite his terror, the quiet software engineer grabbed a burning branch from the fire and struck Blake across the back. Blake's jacket caught fire, and he spun around to attack this new threat, giving Iris the opening she needed. If you believe that monsters like Blake deserve whatever justice they get, hit that subscribe button because karma was about to catch up with this psychopath in the most brutal way possible. As Blake turned to face Jaxon, Iris grabbed him from behind and pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. Blake stumbled backward, his foot catching on one of the oak's massive exposed roots. He fell hard, and the sickening sound that followed would haunt Iris for the rest of her life. One of the tree's broken branches, sharp as a spear from years of storm damage, had pierced straight through Blake's chest. Blake hung there, impaled on the oak tree that had been the centerpiece of his twisted experiment. Blood poured from his mouth as he tried to speak, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The man who'd planned every detail of his victims' deaths had never considered that his own evil might be turned against him. He reached toward his camera with a shaking hand, still obsessed with documenting his research even as his life bled away. Iris stumbled toward the camera, her hands trembling as she spoke directly into the lens. She identified herself and explained what had happened, describing Blake's confession and providing evidence of his murders. She detailed his sick experiment, his manipulation, and his systematic elimination of their friends. The footage shows her covered in blood, exhausted and traumatized, but alive and determined to make sure the truth would be known. Knox was barely conscious but still breathing. Jaxon helped Iris bandage his wounds using supplies from their packs, supplies that Blake had deliberately limited to create desperation. As they worked to save Knox's life, they could hear Blake's final words, whispered curses about his ruined research and complaints that they'd destroyed something important. Even dying, he showed no remorse for the people he'd murdered or the terror he'd inflicted. The three survivors spent that night huddled together under the oak tree, afraid to move Knox in his weakened condition and unsure how to navigate their way out of Blake's deliberately chosen wilderness trap. Iris kept the camera running, documenting their situation and creating a record that would help investigators understand exactly what had happened on Northridge Mountain. As dawn broke over the mountain, Blake's body hung motionless from the oak tree, finally silenced after days of psychological torture. But their nightmare wasn't over yet. They were still lost in unmapped wilderness with limited supplies and a critically injured friend. Worse, as they would soon discover, Blake's death was only the beginning of a mystery that would baffle investigators for years to come. What they didn't know was that someone else had been watching their entire ordeal from the shadows, someone who would ensure that the truth about Blake's experiment would be hidden in the most disturbing way possible. As the three survivors worked to keep Knox alive through that long night, none of them noticed the figure watching from the treeline. Someone had been tracking their movements for days, someone who knew exactly what Blake had been planning and had their own reasons for letting his experiment play out. This unknown observer had witnessed every murder, every moment of terror, and Blake's final violent death. But instead of helping the survivors or alerting authorities, they had their own twisted agenda that would turn an already horrific tragedy into one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. Iris, Jaxon, and Knox managed to survive 3 more days in the wilderness before a search helicopter spotted their signal fire. Knox had developed a serious infection from his wounds and was airlifted to a hospital in critical condition. When investigators interviewed the survivors, their story seemed impossible to believe. A corporate consultant who'd planned an elaborate murder experiment, friends killed and hidden in remote locations, a final confrontation under an ancient oak tree where the killer was impaled on a broken branch. The first search teams found nothing. No bodies where Iris described the murders taking place, no sign of Blake's remains near the oak tree, and no evidence of the violent struggle that had supposedly occurred. The massive oak stood undisturbed in its clearing, with no broken branches, no bloodstains, and no indication that anything unusual had happened there. Investigators began to suspect that trauma and exposure had caused the survivors to create elaborate fantasies to cope with what was probably a series of hiking accidents. But Iris had Blake's camera, and the footage it contained changed everything. Hours of recorded evidence showed Blake's confession, his detailed descriptions of murdering Sage and River, and the final confrontation that ended with his death. The video was analyzed by experts who confirmed it hadn't been edited or manipulated. The survivors were telling the truth about Blake's experiment, but somehow all physical evidence had vanished completely. Months passed with no answers. The case grew cold as investigators exhausted every lead and search teams combed every inch of the mountain's accessible terrain. Blake's family hired private investigators who found nothing. Sage and River's families held memorial services for sons whose bodies would never be recovered. The mystery of what really happened on Northridge Mountain seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Then, 14 months after the disappearance, a routine rescue training exercise discovered something that reopened the entire case. A team exploring the dense forest at the mountain's base found 6 climbing bags wedged unnaturally high in the branches of the same oak tree where Blake had supposedly died. The bags contained personal items belonging to all 6 original climbers, including Blake's own equipment and research notes about his psychological experiment. The discovery made no sense. If Blake had died at that location, who had placed the bags there? The positioning was clearly intentional, arranged in a way that suggested someone wanted them to be found eventually. Inside the bags, investigators found Iris's original camera with additional footage that neither she nor the other survivors remembered recording. The new video showed someone moving through the camp at night, systematically collecting evidence and personal items, but the figure's face was never visible. DNA analysis of bloodstains found on the equipment provided the most disturbing revelation of all. The blood didn't match Blake's genetic profile from samples taken from his apartment. It didn't match any of the other climbers either. Someone else's blood was mixed with the evidence, someone who had never been identified or investigated as part of the original case. The implications were terrifying. Either Blake had faked his own death and somehow altered his DNA, or another person had been involved in the murders all along. Investigators reopened the case with new urgency, but before they could return to the mountain for additional searches, technology provided one final piece of the puzzle. A wildlife monitoring drone captured footage of a lone figure standing beside the oak tree, staring directly into the camera with an expression of cold calculation. The person appeared to be male, approximately Blake's height and build, but the image quality wasn't sufficient for positive identification. The figure stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds, as if he knew he was being recorded and wanted to send a message. Then he turned and walked calmly into the forest, disappearing among the trees like he'd never been there at all. The timestamp showed the footage was recorded just days before the bags were discovered, suggesting that whoever placed them there had been monitoring the area and waiting for the right moment to reveal his work. If you think people like Blake represent pure evil that shouldn't be allowed to escape justice, comment "Justice for Sage and River," because this monster might still be out there. The case remains officially unsolved. Knox recovered from his injuries but suffers from severe PTSD and refuses to discuss the events on the mountain. Jaxon moved across the country and changed his name, trying to escape the nightmare that destroyed his sense of safety forever. Iris continues to speak publicly about their experience, determined to keep the case in the public eye and pressure authorities to find answers. But questions remain that may never be answered. Did Blake really die that night under the oak tree? Or did he somehow stage his own death as part of an even more elaborate experiment? Was someone else involved in his twisted research from the beginning, someone who helped him plan the murders and then cleaned up the evidence afterward? Or did something else happen on Northridge Mountain, something so disturbing that the truth would be worse than the mystery itself? The oak tree still stands in its remote clearing, unchanged by the horror it witnessed. Sometimes hikers report seeing a lone figure near the tree, watching them from the shadows before vanishing into the wilderness. Park rangers have found fresh campsites in the area with no record of permits or registered visitors. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the mountain peaks, some say you can still hear echoes of Blake's voice, promising that his experiment will continue until he finally proves his twisted theories about human nature. The mountain keeps its secrets, and Blake Morrison's fate remains as twisted and disturbing as the man himself.